to. And don't forget, if you need to, you can always, with needle down, slightly raise the presser foot so that you can pivot. And on this particular top, I've got a nice point I need to get to, so I'm going to get to the point on the seam and then turn it completely around so that I've pivoted and got that nice angle that's on the neck edge. I can see a pin poking out there, just get the pin out. So having stitched and pressed this curved seam, you're now ready to clip and notch it. So to do that, you quite literally, I'm going to neaten the edge by just trimming it a bit shorter so you don't have quite so much seam allowance, because this seam allowance is going to be turned through and it will be in the facing or in the seam, and then of course it could be bulky. Now on our outer curve you want to take little wedge shaped notches, and I'm just using nice little scissors so that I don't accidentally cut too far. Cut close to, but obviously not through the stitching. So when that's turned through and the seam folds round the fold, the fabric underneath that's in between in that seam line won't be too bulky. Now on the inner curves, again I can neaten up that seam allowance. Now if I were using a fabric that frayed really badly, I would also neaten that seam allowance with some zigzag stitches. But this isn't too bad, so I won't do that because the seam is going to be enclosed in the seam. So for this I'm just going to take every sort of 3 to 5 centimetres, just little angled clips. So that's the clipping, and the little wedge shapes are the notching. Another thing to do with seams, particularly in facings and things like that, because you've got quite a lot of layers together, and if I was using a thicker fabric, a woven for a jacket for instance, I would grade the seam allowance. To grade the seam allowance I literally cut one at about 1/4 inch or 6 millimetres. And then I can cut the other one, not quite as low, and that's grading. And again, when you turn it through, you'll find there won't be so much bulk within the seam allowance. I'm now going to quickly show you understitching. This pattern doesn't need it because of the way the neck edge is constructed, but it is something that you'll often be asked to do when you're attaching facings. Understitching sounds complicated, but of course it isn't. It's a matter of stitching the seam allowance to the facing only. So you press the seam allowance that you've neatened, clipped or notched up towards the facing, and then literally stitch through the facing and the seam allowance only. So you're stitching the seam allowance to the facing and stitch quite close to the previous stitching that was holding the facing in place to the garment. And that's it. That is understitching. You can see the stitching is on the facing only, not the garment. So when that's turned to the inside, it's completely out of view. And believe it or not, that actually helps hold the facing in place. So to completely finish this garment, the next thing to do is top stitching. Now this is optional, you don't have to do it. Top stitching literally is stitching that is seen on the top. You can use a decorative stitch, as I have round here. And on this garment I've also done a top stitched hem, and I've literally turned up the hem allowance and then tucked the raw edge under so that that's all nicely encased, and then stitched. The stitching shows on the top, and I've just used a regular straight stitch. quick and easy way to finish the garment. That's this garment finished, and because it's got this lovely princess seaming, I haven't had to do darts. So the next thing is, let's have a look at darts. So now I'm going to look at darts. We didn't cover them with the tunic because we didn't need them, they had the princess seaming. But a dart is a really useful technique to know. It's what you use to either take excess fabric out, or indeed if you want to put some shaping in, such as at the bust area. So a dart is a fold of fabric that's wide at the outer edge, tapering to nothing at the point, and by doing that you have given the fabric piece shape. Now to start a dart, firstly you look at the pattern piece and it will show you exactly where to do it and how to mark the fabric. So I very carefully snipped away the circle from the tissue, and then in that circle I'm going to use a chalk pen, or you can use a marking pen, to mark the fabric underneath. And of course you have two pieces normally, so I'm going to use a pin to go through to the underside of the other piece and then mark that as well. So that's the tip or the point of the dart, and then I do the same process at either end, follow the dotted lines down so I make sure I mark the right dart position, and with the other one here. So I can now remove the tissue and I'm ready to fold out that dart and stitch it. Making sure I match the marks front and back, and then pin. And the point again is clearly marked. So I put a pin in the end there, and that's ready to stitch. Now I can hand base this and then stitch it, or I can stitch straight away, which I'm going to do. So starting at the widest point, you lower the needle, then remove the pin so that you don't accidentally put the needle through the pin. And then I'm actually going to get the needle thread and I'm going to pull it and just wrap it round the pin head at the end, and that will actually give me a stitching line. So I can follow that stitching line. I'm just going to reverse stitch at the beginning so that that keeps that stitching in, and following that I'm going to have to remove that, but I'm still keeping that guideline in place. Now when I get to the end, to the point, I'm going to stitch the last 3 or 4 stitches right along the fold of fabric, and then when that's finished I will take it out. So when you get to the end you take it out and then knot the tail ends. Don't backstitch because you don't want to have too much stitching at that point, but of course you do want to make sure it doesn't unravel. So just knot the tail ends and then trim them off. So now you're ready to press the dart, pressing the vertical darts towards the centre and horizontal darts downwards. But before I go onto the pressing board, I'm going to look at double-ended darts. Now these are the darts you might have in the front of a bodice or dress. Double-ended darts are very similar, so they're wide at the centre and they taper to nothing either end. And you'll see that I have the pins going out from the centre and down in both directions, and this is because you start sewing at the centre. So having stitched one leg of the dart, I'm now going to turn it over and stitch the other, again starting in the centre, overlapping the first few stitches so that they're exactly in the same place. So again, I'm going to knot the ends of the fabric at either of the points and then press the dart. Now, because it's a double-ended dart which is used to shape into the body, at the front one, you have them at front at back, but the front ones you've got your body curving. You might want to clip into the centre of the dart take a little wedge-shaped notch or a little piece of cheese. So when this dart is fitted to your body, it will open up and it won't pull or stress. Now, if you've got a fabric that frays a lot, do dab a little bit of fray check on that tiny point near the stitching so that it doesn't fray. And of course, the dart needs to be pressed, as it's a vertical dart, towards the centre. Now, if you're pressing a bust dart, which is going to be quite full, and you want to actually create shape, it's a good idea to use a pressing ham which is curved, and you can press the dart over the ham so you still get that shaping that you want. So now when that's on, the dart is pressed towards the centre and it gives the shaping needed. So there we are, darts are easy when you know how. But do remember, hand knot the tapered end so that you don't have bulky stitching there, and do press the darts really well so that you embed the stitches and give that dart that lovely shaping that you want. Sewing with stretch fabrics. Oh, this is fantastic. I really love sewing with stretch fabrics. They're so good. They're good to wear. They wash easily. You very rarely need to iron them. They pack for holidays and they're great. Of course, also when you're sewing with them, you have less fitting problems because they stretch. Brilliant. But there are a few things you do need to know when you're sewing. For instance, you need ballpoint needles. That's a needle with a very slightly rounded tip. You can't see it, but the packaging will say. You need to use a stretch interfacing that will stretch with it. And you need to use a seam that when you sew, it will stretch. And I'm now going to show you how to do all of that. But first things first. The pattern. When you're going to use a stretch fabric, you'll find that the pattern will tell you to use a stretch fabric. I've chosen this one here. It's a lovely Simplicity design and it's by Callie Ali, and by the way, she's Muhammad Ali's daughter. Now, she does some lovely patterns for Simplicity, and this one tells you stretch or stretch knits only, and it gives you some ideas. Jerseys, velvets, two-way stretch velvets, novelty knits, and you get all sorts of stretch fabrics. I love it. And another really good point about stretch fabrics, because they're stretch, you can normally pull them on so you don't need to insert zips, which means that they're easy to sew and quick to sew. So let's have a go at sewing with stretch fabric. So the first thing you need when you interface is to use a woven interfacing, an interfacing that stretches with the fabric. So when you've interfaced your pieces like facings, they still have the stretch that you need, but also have the stability that you need. The other thing that you need to do is to stay stitch an edge. Of course, there are areas, even on a stretch fabric, that you don't want to stretch. For instance, around a neck edge, or even the shoulders. You don't want it to stretch off the shoulders and maybe slip off. So we can deal with this by stay stitching, and that is a row of stitching within the seam allowance, regular stitch length, or use the lovely edge tape that's fusible, lovely and quick. And you just literally fuse it in place along the seam line, and then that will actually add, I'm going to press it, hold it pressed down for at least 10 seconds, and that will add the stability you need and hold that bit nice and firm. And that's it. So I've now added that, and that won't stretch too much, whereas if I hadn't added, it would have been really stretchy in a place I don't want the stretch. So that's easily achieved. The next thing is to look at the needles. I mentioned ballpoint needles. Now they're brilliant because they're designed to work with stretch fabrics. They might be called ballpoint, stretch, jersey, all the same thing. They've got that rounded tip. And you can get twin ballpoint needles or stretch needles. That's brilliant too, because that means you get 2 rows of perfectly parallel stitching at the same time. Great for hemming on stretch fabrics. Occasionally stretch fabrics can be a bit of a pig to feed through when you're sewing, but of course there's a solution. Use a specialist foot. Now many machines will come with a Teflon coated foot. That's great, it helps the fabric go through as it glides on. Or you could get a roller foot, this is an optional extra, or indeed a walking foot. Now this is absolutely fantastic. It looks like an instrument of torture, but it really is great. Not only will you feed the fabrics through evenly because it feeds from top and the bottom, but you can use it with plaids, checks, stripes, velours, furs, anything like that at all. Really great little foot. So now sewing on stretch fabrics. Now if you're sewing a seam that you want to be able to still stretch with you, then you need to sew with a stretch stitch. Most modern machines like this lovely little brother have a stretch stitch, but if not, a zigzag stitch will do the same job, just a small zigzag. So I'm going to select my stretch stitch, and on this machine I turn my little dial, and this tells me what foot to use, it tells me what the stretch is, what the width is and what the length is. It's fantastic. So off we go. And now I'm using a pink thread purely so I can show what it looks like when it's stitched. So there you can see a very tiny zigzag stitch, which is a stretch stitch. So you've still got some stretch in the fabric, which is brilliant, and the stitching won't split when you try and pull it on and off. Now while you don't have to neaten your seams to prevent them from fraying, because really it doesn't fray, it still is a good idea. It gives a nice neat finish, but also you find with some knit fabrics or stretch fabrics they tend to curl at the edges, and you want to prevent that because that'll add bulk in the seam lines which you don't want. So just like any other straight stitch seam, I'm going to neaten the edges by using a zigzag. So I'm just going to stitch that nice and close to my original stitching, and then once the seam is stitched I will trim close to that zigzag, and that will prevent it from curling and creating bulk that I don't want. So I'm literally going to trim close to that stitching, and then press the seam. Now you note on this one I've stitched the seam allowances together, but if I was using a heavier stretch fabric, as with ordinary fabric, I would have pressed the seam allowance open and then stitched the zigzag neatening on either of them separately. So when you're stitching a bias seam, just remember that that's very, very stretchy, and the best thing therefore to do is stitch it just the same with the stretch stitch and then neaten it with the zigzag. But when you're stitching a bias seam, just stretch the fabric slightly as you stitch it. Not too much, but just a little. And when this is pressed flat, it will stop the seam from puckering. Another technique for sewing with knits, top stitching, brilliant. And you can top stitch the hem, so you just turn up the hem allowance and then top stitch it in place from the right side. But use a twin needle. You get two parallel lines of stitching at the same time. It's a lovely effect. You can use matching threads, contrasting threads. You can have two different threads in each of the two needles. Lots of choices. I'm just using a straight stitch because for the hem I don't need it to be able to stretch because there's plenty of room. If I did, of course, I could still use the stretch stitch even with a twin needle. So I've got my two needles threaded up, and I'm going to use the edge of the presser foot here as a guide to my stitching line. Sewing with twin needles is great. You can get so many different effects. It's so lovely. And all modern machines can sew with a twin needle. Even if you don't have two spindles to put your thread on, wind a bit of thread onto a bobbin and put that on the same spindle as your main thread, and then thread both through the usual path. So there you have 2 perfectly parallel rows of stitching done in one pass, and on the back it's just the zigzag stitch because you've only got the 1 bobbin thread. Press that to make it nice and flat, and you've got a perfectly professional finish. Sewing with stretch fabrics is great. They're enjoyable to sew with. They're so easy to work with once you master these few little tips. So enjoy! And now for my next clip, I'm going to go on to zips.